Pelosi, and I want to speak to you today about the concept of Black Lives Matter. When I say the concept, I don't want to talk about the organization. I'm not a spokesperson or I have any connection to that organization. But I want to talk about the concept of Black Lives Matter and why it's important. Anytime that you have a concept that grabs our people and spurs them to action, that is a force to be reckoned with. And that conversely, it becomes a force that concerns other people who are always worried about black people becoming conscious and acting in an organized fashion in their interests. That concerns them. So one of the things that when Black Lives Matter started gaining momentum and galvanizing black people around it to support it, they understood that they had to find a way to sabotage this movement. Because once a movement starts, you can't always tell how big it's going to get. So how did they try to sabotage it? Well, they took several approaches. First approach was to try to trivialize it, try to play it down. How did they do that? Well, they didn't try to stop it directly. They tried to deflect. Deflecting is easier. So they said, well, sure, of course, we agree with you. Black lives do matter. In fact, hell, all lives matter, right? So what's your point? As if they didn't know what you were talking about. And always be clear on this. A lot of times you'll hear people saying things and it sounds like they don't know what you're talking about. They understand exactly what you're talking about.
I think if there was a movement called White Lives Matter, it would be considered racist.
When folks say that Black lives matter, they're not saying that white lives don't. What they're saying is they want their lives to matter as much
They know
as...
all too well what you're speaking about, but their job is to play dumb and to divert your energy trying to explain and articulate something to them that anyone with a healthy mind could understand. Anyone in a similar situation would take similar actions, right? I mean, is it really any great leap of cognition to understand that anyone in the same position that black people find themselves in would take actions to alleviate that situation? So what else did they do? Well, on the other hand, they decided they would try to criminalize people and try to make it look like they were some kind of instigators of violence.
Black identity extremists, that's the label an internal report by the FBI's Counterterrorism Division is giving to black activists around the country. The report says they pose a growing threat of premeditated violence against law enforcement in response to police brutality. Former government officials and legal experts say no such movement exists, and this is an attempt by the FBI and the Donald Trump administration to find an equivalent threat to white supremacists and silence black activists.
Between 1956 and 1971, the FBI ran a counterintelligence program named COINTELPRO that was initiated by J. Edgar Hoover. COINTELPRO mainly targeted civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King, and it's commonly understood that this was an abuse of its surveillance power in a manner to suppress a peaceful movement. So I would like to ask Mr. Chair unanimous consent to enter this report into the record, which is Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement officers. I believe earlier you said you were not familiar with the report. Is that correct?
Well, I haven't read it. I know some of the alleged targeting of officers by
okay, so I would
group.
like to know, and I'll ask you about that in a minute. So you are somewhat familiar with it. Who had the power in your department to order a report like this?
I'm not sure how that report got ordered. I don't believe I explicitly approved it or directed it.
Okay, so you haven't necessarily read the report, but you are familiar with the term Black identity extremists?
Well, I think so, yes.
So could you tell me what that term means to you? Do you believe that there is a movement of African Americans that identify themselves as black identity extremists, and what does that movement do?
Well, it'd be interesting to see the conclusions of that report. But I'm aware that there are groups that do have an extraordinary commitment to their racial identity, and some have transformed themselves even into violent activists.
Are you aware of white organizations that do this as well? Given that white supremacy is well-documented, well-researched movements such as the neo-Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, et cetera, are they white identity extremists?
I didn't follow that question.
Still, they wanted to say that things that happened as a result of the demonstration, and try to make them be responsible for the actions of individuals. You know, again, this is something that they understood that was not the case. Other methods of subterfuge will try to, again, pivot and divert the energy. Well, why are you people always talking about, what the police are doing? What about what you people do to yourselves in your own community? How come you don't protest that? Every time I hear that, I really don't know what to say. Not because I don't have an answer. It's just because the statement is so patently disingenuous and so patently dishonest and just plain ridiculous. Anybody that has even seen any kind of, watched any movement in the black community has seen an organization like MASK, Mothers Against Senseless Killings, groups like the Disruptors, poor former gang members who have reformed themselves and try to keep others from following such a, the treacherous and dead-end path. Candlelight vigils, Stop the Violence movements. I mean, countless things that black people have done in regards to this. But they come and say, well, what are you people doing? How come you don't do anything about that? Now, there's two ways of looking at that when they say that. Either one, they're totally ignorant and don't know, or two, they're very shrewd and they know all too well. If they're being shrewd and know all too well, trust me, there's nothing you can say because they already know. If they're ignorant and don't know, my suggestion is, as opposed to arguing with them and trying to educate them, you might point them to Amazon or the local library and maybe recommend a book or two on the subject. But don't get distracted and led astray and diverted from the issue at hand. Because again, the issue is a very simple one. It's not that deep. It's not that profound. It's not that complicated. When the police commit a crime, they should be punished. That's it. Is that hard to grasp? So you can talk about anything else you want, but what it comes down to, when the police commit a crime, they should be punished, regardless of who it is. Because then you could say all lives matter. Because if all lives matter, you wouldn't have to have that conversation. It would go without saying. When a black child goes missing in the community, if all lives mattered, they would take the same role. They would do the same thing they do when a white child goes missing. There'd be no need for anybody to say, well, how come you're not looking into this? The reality is that black lives in the eyes of this society does not matter. Our lives just do not matter. And for us to point that out is not a bad thing. And that's not something that we can just let go. And that's not something we can just, make like that's not the case. The reality is that black lives in the eyes of this society does not matter. And it is incumbent upon us to make it clear that our lives do matter. And yes, to be honest, that needs to be installed in some of these brothers and sisters in the community too, because you know what? We internalize some self-hate and we take our cue from the larger white society that says that your life don't matter. You know? So there's some issues, there's definitely some issues that need to be addressed at home. But the reality is that we have a different standard for those who are detriments to the community versus those who are sworn to uphold and protect the community. In other words, Tebow the drug dealer, Tebow the thug, and Danny the drug dealer, they're here. We don't have high expectations of them, but we do have high expectations of those who are sworn to uphold and protect the community. It's like if the house is on fire and the fire department comes and they stick a hose in there and all of a sudden start shooting gasoline out of the hose onto the fire. You'd be upset. They wouldn't say, well, you shouldn't have had, well, where's your fire detective, your fire alarm if you were so concerned? No one would expect them to say that, right? Your expectation is that they will come to put out the fire, not to add fuel to the fire. So you would have every right to be more upset with them than you would with someone who is a negative influence. And yes, black people know that there's negative influences in the community. Like, people act like no one knows that. That's ridiculous. What's being said here is very clear. Yes, Black Lives Matter. Yes, people have a right to demonstrate and agitate and organize until such time that when something happens that is clear that was wrong, that the appropriate punishment will be meted out and people will be treated properly. And it does happen sometimes. Yeah, I'll point it out. Two quick examples. First, a bad example and then a good example. I think it was in Texas. Black woman calls because this white neighbor chokes her son because apparently he littered. The cop gets there and instead of arresting the man, asks the woman, well, how come he didn't pick up the litter? And she's like, well, what are you talking about? Well, one thing leads to another. And next thing you know, the police is wrestling her on the ground and arrest her. The police department in the Broad, the police, said, well, what should happen to this person? Well, what happened to him was he was given a 2-week suspension. That's what happened to him. Conversely, there was a situation where this cop just punched this brother in the face like for no reason in a traffic stop. Another cop came over and kicked him. And you know what happened? They fired him. Cop had 19 years on the job. I know he hurt, but that's what should have happened. Two different situations. You've had more of that type of situation, there'd be no need for Black Lives Matter, because people know that when that type of thing did happen by these, quote, individuals, that the police as an institution would do the right thing. But if the police as an institution backs the BS, then that's why you have a Black Lives Matter. And that's why you're going to continue to have a Black Lives Matter until things change.